Abhimanyu Mishra has a chance to become the youngest chess grandmaster in the history of the world. As of the recording of this video, he has 2 grandmaster norms. He needs 29 rating points and 4 months to do it, to beat Sergei Karyakin's record at 12 years old. They both will be 12 years old, but he has a chance to do it a little bit earlier. He just got his 2nd norm. And I want to go over a game with you that he played, a brilliant game. His opponent expected the Najdorf. His opponent is Jakub Seeman, a 2,300 FIDE player. But he decided, Abhimanyu Mishra decided to play the French Winawer instead. Surprise his opponent. E4, E6, D4, D5, knight C3, bishop B4, E5, C5, A3, bishop takes C3, check BC3. Now, you'll see that black has weakened white's structure. There's an isolated A pawn, there are double pawns on the C file, but in exchange, he's given up a very valuable piece, his dark squared bishop. So there's an exchange here, and he's going to try to attack white. Watch how he does it. Knight E7, queen to G4, attacking this vulnerable square at G7, right here you see. Queen C7. So black is saying, go ahead, take the pawn. In fact, the name of this variation is the French Winawer poisoned pawn variation. The idea is that pawn is dangerous to take. It's poisoned. If you take it, black's going to play the rook to G8, attack the queen, and open up the G file for attack. Nevertheless, that's what white usually does. But in this case, white plays bishop to D3. Now, what white is looking for when he plays that, delays capturing on G7, is he wants black to take on D4, and what you get is a murky endgame. It's a playable position for both sides, but it's not what black wants. It's not a great classic attacking position. So what Abhimanyu does instead is he plays C4, locking up the structure. And what he wants to do is lock up the structure and then attack on the king side like he had already planned on doing. Point of interest, this is the way Anish Giri recommends handling this position in his French course that's on Chessable. So bishop E2. What white wants to do here, he wants to play the pawn to A4, play the C1 bishop to A3, and put it on that really nice diagonal, that A3 F8 diagonal. So what black does, he plays queen to A5. He hits the C3 pawn, and when white defends it, he wants to play the queen to A4 and blockade that pawn at A3 so white can't do what he wants to do. Bishop D2, defending that pawn. First thing he does, he plays the knight to F5. A very good square for the knight, and it defends the G7 pawn that had been hanging for so long. Queen to F4. Now, this is a novelty. It's the new move of the game. In my database, no one had ever played queen to F4 in this position, although it is a very thematic move. It's a common idea. And what he wants to do is move out of the way so that he can play the G pawn to G4, hit that knight on F5 and kick it away, because the knight's really well placed on F5. So he wants to play G4 and gain some space on the king side. Black continues with queen to A4, blockading the A3 pawn, hitting that C2 pawn, which is also undefended. White defends it with bishop to D1. Black develops with knight C6. White plays knight F3. Black plays bishop to D7. Now, white plays knight to G5. And this shows that he probably doesn't understand this position very well. Perhaps his idea is to take on F7, king F7, and then G4 with trying to take advantage of a pin. But it's really, he's on the wrong track with this move. A better move, and Abhimanyu said this, is to play knight to H4, to directly challenge that knight on F5. What he would have done, he said, is just castle long. Then when white takes, he takes with the E-pawn. He would have just played the rooks over to the G and H file and would advance advanced with H6, G5, and continued his attack. After knight G5, black plays H6. He thought maybe white wanted to do something like this, takes G4. But in this case, all black has to do is to take the C6 knight, move that to E7, and then when white takes on F5, he just retake, and he still has a knight on the F5 square. So white retreats the knight to H3 instead. Rook F8. So Black is violating a well-known principle, but this happens a lot in this variation. The principle is you want to attack on the side of the board where you have more space. But in the Winawer, a lot of times, Black will lock the structure, getting a lot of space on the queen side, but then attack on the king side where he has less space. That's what Abhimanyu is doing here. He's taking that rook and lining it up against White's queen. He wants to play f6 and open up lines on the king side. g4. Now he carries out his threat. He kicks that knight out of f5. Knight goes back to e7. g5. Now this is a question mark move. This is a bad move. It's probably the worst move of the game. And the reason it's a bad move is because after kicking the knight out of f5, by playing g5, he just gives the f5 square right back. And it exchanges, causes a pawn exchanges, which opens up lines, which is what Black wants anyway. So g5 is a bad move. If you put it in your computer, the position goes from equal to about +2 for Black after White plays it. So the knight just goes right back. Okay. g8-6, g8-6, opening up lines. Bishop g4. White says, this knight on f5 is so annoying. I'm willing to give up my c2 pawn that the bishop at d1 was defending. See, Black can just take the pawn at c2 if he wants, just to get rid of that annoying knight. So Black just says, I don't have to take the c2 pawn. I'll just move my other knight to e7. And now if you take my knight on f5, I'll just take it right back with my other knight. But the pawn at c2 is still hanging. White defends it with rook a2. But Abhimanyu thought king d1 was probably a better way to defend. Goes ahead and castles long. And queen to f3. Now this does a couple of things. It allows a knight to possibly go to f4. It also gets the queen away from opposite that rook. It literally takes White 2 moves to get the queen off of the f-file because there's nowhere else he can go. He has to play queen f3, queen e2. It's the only way. So Black begins his final attack, f6, coming in, opening up that f-file. Queen gets out of the way. fe5, exchanging pawns and opening up lines. White takes with the queen. What happens if he takes with the d-pawn? Black just plays d4 and his pieces come alive. The bishop goes to c6, the rook on d8 is powerful, and he would just get completely swarmed with his king in the middle of the board. So he takes with the queen. Black plays a knight to c6, hitting that queen. So the queen comes back. e5, exchanging more pawns, opening more lines. The e5, knight e5. And you'll notice the queen can take the knight, but if the queen takes the knight, Black would just play the rook to e8, rook de8, and the queen would be pinned to the king. So the knight is safe for now. White plays the bishop to h5, controls that e8 square, and also there are some potential tactics with knight takes bishop that are avoided by playing bishop to h5. A knight to h4. And you'll notice for the rest of the game, Black puts a lot of pressure on that f3 square. He's got 2 knights and a rook attacking it right now, and that square becomes a real problem for White. Knight goes to f4, rook f5, possibly doubling on the f-file, but there are also some tactics that he can play with the rook taking the bishop. Bishop to e3, queen c6. This is a double attack, or a potential double attack. He's threatening to play d4, which would attack the bishop at a3, and also he would be threatening queen takes h1. So White moves the rook out of the way. Black plays d4, again, piling onto that f3 square. Now he's got both knights and the queen at c6 piling on that square. White takes the d-pawn, and then boom, the knight lands on the square, forking the king and the rook. White plays king to f1. Black could take the rook, but he says, you know what, I can take that h2 pawn first and then just come right back to the same position. Knight h2 check. The king can't go to g2. He's got to go back to e1. And he just returns right back to where he was. And in this position, White resigned, but there are some really cool tactics that were not seen. Obviously, if he goes to d1, Black just gets the rook without any compensation, right? If he goes to f1, there's a neat little tactic. Rook takes knight. And if he recaptures the rook, bishop to h3 check, rook g2, bishop to g2 mate. A great game. We're 4 months away, and we're rooting for Abhimanyu. It would be great if he became the youngest Grandmaster in history.